بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وآله وصحبه ومن والاه. اللهم يا منور يا فتاح، نور قلوبنا بنور معرفتك، وافتح لنا أبواب حكمتك، وانشر علينا خزائن رحمتك، إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا، وزدنا علما وإخلاصا وصدقا في الدين، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. وصلى اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. الحمد لله. قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى: ونفعنا بعلومه وعلومكم في الدارين آمين. ويجب له تعالى القدرة والإرادة المتعلقتان بكل ممكن، إذا العجز عن بعضها مستلزم للعجز عن جميعها، وذلك يستلزم استحالة وجودها لتوقف كل حادث في وجوده وإعدامه على اقتدار فاعله، وفي تخصيصه على إرادته، وفي كونه مرادا على علمه. So Imam al-Sanūsī goes through the first two positive attributes, which are power and will. So up to this point we've gone through the self-attribute, the sifa nafsiyya, which we said was wujud. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mawjud, meaning that He has existence, that God exists. And then he presented 5 attributes of negation. So no beginning, no end, no likeness, no need, no multiplicity, no partners. And now we move into what are called the positive attributes. And positive attributes are attributes of meaning substantiated from the essence. Ma'ani qa'ima bil-dhat. It's any attribute subsisting with its subject that necessarily entails an additional predicate for that subject, like His being powerful, subhanahu wa ta'ala, we say entails from the attribute of power. So he says it's necessary for God to have power and will. Why? Roughly speaking, we said the world exists and must have a cause. That cause must also have power by which every contingent thing can be brought into existence and subsequently be taken out of existence. Does that sound good? In other words, the world exists and must have a cause. If we say that the world exists and has a cause, and we know that that cause is necessary, in order for that necessary being to existentiate the world around us, it must have power. And ultimately, in recognizing that, you also recognize that that capacity it affords this being the ability to destroy these existences, these contingent realities. So the world is brought into existence, and things within the world, including the world itself, could potentially be taken out of existence vis-a-vis the power, vis-a-vis qudra. Now from there, what Imam al-Sanūsī will want to say is that because this world is an infinite number of possible worlds, like this world could have been a completely different way. It's a particular way. So when we look at the world, we're not just seeing that there are contingent realities, but that those contingent realities are specified, are determined in a particular manner. And they could have been determined in a completely different manner. So since this world is an infinite number of possible worlds, this cause also needs a will to select for the world to be in this way rather than an infinite possible number of alternative ways. So there has to be a selective principle for this world to come into existence over another. Does that sound good? Now from there he says, al-muta'alliqatan. So like power and will, al-muta'alliqatan bikulli mumkinin. They both connect to, they both attach to, these two attributes attach to all possibility. Now, this concept of attachment or connection, ta'alluq in Arabic, is the manner in which the mutakallimun of Ahl Sunnah are going to explain how the infinite comes into contact with the finite. In other words, how does the world exist in the particular ways that it exists vis-a-vis the executive order that is given? And so that explanation of at-ta'alluq, i.e. that there's an attachment between the attributes, the positive attributes of the infinite being and the finite world, creation itself, becomes that modality by which we come to understand how things come into existence and are determined in the particular fashions that they are determined. So what he says here is that this will and power connect to every contingent thing, which means that they don't connect to necessary things and they don't connect to impossible things. And remember what we said about things that are necessary. Insofar as necessary existence, for example, there's only one, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the only necessary being. Every other being is contingent. Now there are also necessary relations that exist within created things. Like, for example, in order to be a physical object, it necessarily must have spatial extension. So its existence is not necessary. It's selected by Allah and created. And if it exists, it must have some height, some width, some length. So the specific measurements are selected by Allah. So its existence is selected and created, but the fact that it's a physical object means that it necessarily has height and width and length, like by extension of the very nature of what the thing is itself. The fact that it has height, width, and length is by definition. The fact that it is a specific height and a specific width and a specific length, we would say is by Allah's will and by His power. So when we say that the attachment or the connection of the power and the will do not connect to necessary things, nor do they connect to impossible things. Well, they don't connect to necessary things because by definition, necessary things don't need a cause. And if the power and the will are explained as those attributes that cause change into things, well then it's obvious that that would not hold in relationship to something that is necessary. If they could be caused or willed, then they would not be necessary. And impossible things are things that do not have any existence at all. Like we've had conversations about this, but the things that are non-existent by definition are what we mean by impossible things. Like, so for example, when we talked about in the classes, I think 2 or 3 classes before, the idea of a 4-sided triangle. Is there a 4-sided triangle? There is no 4-sided triangle. It's actually just a jumble of words at that point. So when we say something like a 4-sided triangle, we're not actually talking about anything. Like, this is not it's not a substance or essence or quiddity that can be brought into existence. Impossible things do not indicate anything at all. The mind can't conceive it. Another example is a second God. that's impossible. So when, we talked about that insofar as the dalail, or the proofs that we gave for wahdaniyah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala necessarily being one, we went into detail when it came to that particular issue. But this is important because sometimes questions can be framed that are done to try and hold absurd positions, and then ask them in relationship to the way in which we come to understand God, right? And I remember being in college and hearing this. I'm sure that many of you have heard this before, but like the classic argument that is used to stump believers when someone says, can God create a rock that's so big that even he cannot lift it? What the questioner is really asking is, can God have power and not power? Can God have power and not power? Having power and not power is a logical contradiction, which means that it's an absurdity, which means that it's impossible. There is no such thing as power and not power being a thing. That's an impossibility. And the way that they frame the question, obviously, is to try and confuse believers who want to say that God can do everything. So they assume that they found like this brilliant argument to show how belief in God is absurd or something. They haven't. All they've done is show how they're being absurd by positing something that's absurd. So now, the language by which this question is also being framed causes somewhat of a dilemma. Because to say God can or can't do, for us, we would say is somewhat problematic. Like, we don't say God can or can't do X, Y, and Z. From a Shara'i perspective, we would just say this is bad decorum and misleading. In the literature, we say God's will and power do not connect to impossible things, and they do not connect to necessary things, as we know. So what that means is all of God's attributes are necessary, including his existence. So if we say his power and will connect to himself, it's assuming that his power and will, i.e. the attributes that bring into existence and take out of existence, could be said of God himself. Could he create or destroy himself? Like, if you want to say, well, he can do anything. I thought you said he can do anything. Well, that needs to be qualified. Does everybody understand what this is? You understand what I'm saying here? If his power and will connect to everything, i.e. necessary, possible, and impossible things, then what's the problem with that? Well, if that were possible, then it wouldn't be God. Right? So this is a finer detail, but it's also extremely important for people to understand. And it also brings out the emphasis on understanding logic properly, understanding reason properly, and then understanding how that particular conceptualization relates to the way in which we come to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his relationship with creation. So the point is, his power and will don't connect to necessary things, because necessary things don't need a cause. They're not willed into existence, and they can't be destroyed. And it doesn't connect to impossible things because impossibility implies that it necessarily doesn't exist. Like power, like something having power and not power. Or, is trying to say that something can be both eternal and finite. Can God be eternal and finite? Oh no, I thought you said that he could do everything. Like, you see the absurdity here? This is what's going on. So an impossible thing is, when you examine every possible thing, what you find is that it reduces to nothing. And what we say then is that God's will and power do not connect to nothing. It doesn't connect to no thing. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Okay. So then he continues and he says, وَيَجْبُ لَهُ تَعَالَى الْعِلْمِ. It's necessary that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also have knowledge. الْمُتَعَلِّقُ بِكُلِّ وَاجِبٍ وَجَائِزٍ وَمُسْتَحِيلٍ, that are connected or attached to every necessary, possible, and impossible thing. لأن الاختصاص بالبعد يستلزم الحدوث لافتقار الصفة حينئذ إلى الفاعل، وحدوثها يستلزم حدوث موصوفها لاستحالة تعريه عنها وعن أضدادها. Because delimiting the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the connection that He has, okay, to some of the modalities would imply contingency. Like if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only knew things that were possible, for example, that would entail that you're delimiting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge. And if you're delimiting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge, it means that His knowledge is, this attribute would be contingent, since the attribute would be dependent upon an agent. And if it's contingent, that what it describes would also be deficient due to the impossibility of completely uncovering what it is and its opposite. So the next attribute that Imam al-Sanūsī is actually bringing up here is knowledge. So you can see kind of in the hierarchy of the attributes being presented, he begins with power, and then he goes to will, and then he goes to knowledge. Now, knowledge is an attribute that we say reveals, and there's actually much more discussion of the attributes that we can discuss, but our main task is to understand why these doctrinal claims are true. So we won't go there, but perhaps we might reflect on it in upcoming sessions. So the question here is, if there is a selection, if there's a determination being done, as we said with the will, can it be done without knowing what you're selecting? Can a determination be made without knowing what it is that you're determining? We kind of go back and forth on this one. Some say, yeah, no. Okay, so why? So you have to, okay, so no. You have to know, you have to have knowledge to make a selection, given the understanding of the attributes that we have discussed. I mean, recall that we're talking about necessary power and necessary will. So when we say that you have to have knowledge in order for you to determine a thing to be one way over an infinite number of possible alternatives, what we're saying here is that the creator, the cause of the universe, must have knowledge, and this knowledge is connected to everything, necessary, possible, and impossible. There's a very interesting discussion, actually, that pertains to knowledge on the notion of hikmah as well, and what it means. And this continues to develop. But many of the ulama actually say that there is hikmah, wisdom, which refers to the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's another one which is called ihkam. Ihkam. And ihkam means a kind of harmonious and perfectly fitting together of things, a kind of precision in the things that are being enacted. Now this is interesting because today there's also this concept that scientists call the Anthropic Principle. Has anybody heard of the Anthropic Principle before? So the Anthropic Principle basically says that life would not have been possible with the slightest change in any part of creation. Like, for example, if the gravitational constant was even slightly modified, it would lead to the destruction of existence or non-existence. And this seems to fit into a statement in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, لِيَعْلَمَ أَنَّ قَدْ أَبْلَغُوا رِسَالَاتِ رَبِّهِمْ وَأَحَاطَ بِمَا لَدَيْهِمْ وَأَحْصَى كُلَّ شَيْءٍ عَدَدًا. وَأَحْصَى كُلَّ شَيْءٍ عَدَدًا. That He quantified everything by precise number. Now, obviously, when scientists posit the Anthropic Principle, it's based on the assumption that these particulars are necessary for existence itself. Now, would we say that? No. Okay? We would refute that. And we would say that it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who's necessary and everything else is possible. Like, if there was no oxygen, could Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still create people? Of course, right? He doesn't need for there to be oxygen for us to breathe and sustain our existence. It's God who does that. Like, He could very well make us breathe water if He wanted to do it like that. No problem. So, what ihkam means, in contrast to this notion of the Anthropic Principle, obviously, but still related in many ways, is a kind of fitting together, a perfection, a precision, not that He could not have done it otherwise, but that He has chosen to do so vis-a-vis this kind of precise and harmonious fashion. And the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made the world in such a way that we can understand through our empirical judgments, that when we examine the world, we come to know that even a fraction of a shift from the constants in the world and the entirety of the world would be in shambles, would go into non-existence. So they say there is ihkam in the world that provides a wisdom and a perfection that exists within the confines of contingent existence, i.e. the world itself, the universe. And through our understanding of this, we come to know something about the Creator, the one who brought all of this into existence. Now, that does not mean that these ihkam extend to the necessary being, and this is going to be very important for us to decipher, right? Like, you have to distinguish between the two. Like, are we saying that His hikmah is His knowledge? Is it something else? Okay. The reality is that God created the world in this way that manifests beauty and precision and harmony and this perfectly fitting together of things. But He didn't have to do that. So these apparent purposes and precisions and beauty and harmony that exists in the world, right, are placed by the Creator for the creation, but not necessarily that those things extend to the Creator. And this is somewhat difficult to grasp, but what we're saying here is that He created the world in this way, in a way that manifests this kind of harmony and beauty, but that He didn't have to do that, which is a mind-boggling notion, to say the least. Which means that this order, this hikmah, is there actually to indicate something to us. Like, for example, if I were to, I could create something in a way in that when people see it, they are obliged to recognize something about the very nature of who I am, given their observation and examination of that thing. Like, I'm trying to tell you something about who I am in the way in which I have created this particular thing. That is what ultimately is being manifested here. And that means that we should be paying attention to something. Like, when we look at the world and we examine it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ, that we're going to show them our signs on the horizons and in themselves, such that they know that we are the real, right? That this is truth, that this is reality, i.e. that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-haq. So we should be paying attention to these things in the sense that we can infer from the way in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen to create it that He must have certain attributes. It's a particular way, and it didn't need to be like that, which means God did it to tell us something. All right, which brings us back to the proof. There are two ways that we can argue for knowledge, and in this particular text, Imam al-Sanūsī argues from will to knowledge, which makes sense. So we said that there had to have been a selection, and selection means that there had to have been knowledge. Because in order to select from different possibilities, you have to know what you're selecting. Like the selection between all contingent things. So this means that the being had to have had knowledge. Okay, that's a good, yeah. So, and this actually came up. I'm not saying that it's impossible for, let me give you an example of this. And this is actually going to come from the other argument. The other argument is to say that we know that the world had to have been created. From there, we examine the world and we discern. From there, we examine the world and we come to recognize that there's order. It could have been chaotic, but it has order and these anthropic principles. And the fact that there is order means something distinct. It indicates something. What does it indicate? It indicates knowledge. So to give an analogy, for example, you walk into a room and in the room you see two paintings. One painting is this very beautiful and intricately designed and precise painting, right? Like a painting of like a horizon or like geometric shapes or, you know, something like that. And the other painting just looks like there's a bunch of paint splattered all over the place. Now, when you see these two paintings, if you knew nothing else other than you walked into the room and you saw these two paintings, you could infer from the painting that just looks like a bunch of paint is splattered everywhere, that it had to have been caused by something. And likewise, you could say the exact same thing about the painting that is very precise and beautiful and intricately designed. Both of these paintings must have been caused by something. But in addition to both having a cause, you would know that the beautiful painting was caused by something that had knowledge, that had a will and a selection and a kind of precision. Because the indication is that these selections are precise and they're beautiful, which is an indication of knowledge. Yeah. So, again, to go back to this point now, okay. Right, because I'm not saying that it's impossible for both paintings to have been created by something with knowledge. Like, for example, we could say, you know, Ibrahim could have taken a bunch of paint and splattered it on one of the easels. Does Ibrahim have knowledge? Ibrahim has knowledge, which means this splattering could have been done by something with knowledge. But if I didn't see him create it, I wouldn't be able to immediately discern from the painting itself that something with knowledge created it. Does that make sense? Like the wind could have created this painting for all we know, right? The wind could have like knocked over a bucket of paint and it splattered all over this easel. And we know that wind doesn't have knowledge. Does that make sense? I.e., so it's not evident from the painting. I can't infer that from the painting per se. It's possible, but it's not something that I can immediately infer. Versus the one that is intricately precise and is beautiful. That one I could look at and immediately know that this could not have been done by something that doesn't have knowledge. Like, it's not like wind knocked over a bucket of paint and then this happened. So the way, and this is extremely important in understanding the presentation that Imam al-Sanūsī is actually giving of these attributes. We begin with power, and then we go to will, and then we go to knowledge. So the way that the mutakallimun of Ahl Sunnah argued from design is from order or hikmah in the universe to the attribute of knowledge. The theologians argue from order in the universe to knowledge, not to existence. Existence of the world is argued from cause. And this is a very important point, particularly when we look at the types of arguments from fine-tuning that want to try and hold that the existence of a necessary being somehow follow from this particular concept. Does that make sense? So the existence of a cause, the existence of the world is argued from cause, not from knowledge. All right? And that's the point that I'm trying to stress here. So then he says, وَيَجْبُ لَهُ تَعَالَى السَّمْعُ وَالْبَصَرُ الْمُتَعَلِّقَانِ بِجَمِيعِ الْمَوْجُودَاتِ والكلام المنزه عن الحرف والصوت والتقديم والتأخير والكل والبعد والتجديد والسكوت المتعلق بما يتعلق به العلم ودليل هذه الثلاثة الشرع. So these are the last three attributes. He says it's necessary for God to have hearing and to have seeing that are attached to everything that is in existence. And everything that is in existence means things that exist, necessary and possible. Necessary and contingent. Impossible things don't exist. And it's necessary that he has speech, which is, as he says, transcendent from having letters and sounds and a beginning and a prolonging and a whole or part or some revived silence, and that is attached to everything that his knowledge is connected to. And then he says the proof for these three attributes are revelation. So before we delve into this discussion, Imam al-Sanūsī actually points out that, as we said, there are things which are verifiable through aqli judgments, through rational judgments, and those are attributes that can be known with dalil. And those are the attributes that we have taken thus far before we got to these three. So there are attributes, we can say, that can be known through the aql, the intellect alone. And there are attributes that can be known through wahi. And there are attributes that can be known by both, without that entailing any circular reasoning. And that's the crucial point here. So the mu'tamad is that these three final attributes, the verified opinion here, is that these final three attributes, hearing, seeing, and speech, are known through wahi. We don't arrive at them through rational arguments. Some of the ulama attempted to provide rational arguments, demonstrations for them, but they ultimately said it's really only properly known through revelation. So with the other attributes, before we got to these attributes, we actually have a sufficient amount of knowledge to be able to make the claim that it's possible that this all-knowing and all-willing and able and necessary being, with all of the entailments that we've gone through, no beginning, no end, etc., this being who created the world, can also create prophets and send them to the people. If we derived this group of attributes, in other words, that we've gone through so far, existence, power, will, knowledge, life, etc., and we did so by means of revelation, like we said, we know that he has existence and we know that he has power and will and knowledge, and we actually know that vis-a-vis revelation, not vis-a-vis the intellect. We know them through wahi, which is predicated on establishing the truthfulness of the messengers based on they're providing miracles, then ultimately we would be making a self-generative claim. And we've seen this before. And this is actually one of the things that atheists, particularly who enter into debate with theists, will constantly charge theists with. That you're constantly falling into holding self-generative claims. Well, I know that God exists. Well, how do you know that God exists? Well, I know that God exists because he created the Quran. Like the Quran says that he exists. Okay, well, who wrote the Quran? Well, God wrote the Quran. Well, that's a self-generative claim. So we have to be able to show, using the mind alone, everything that is necessary for us to be able to verify the claim of the Prophet's prophethood, which is the verification for accepting what is being revealed to him, i.e., the Quran. Okay, does that make sense? So, up to this point, and before arguing for hearing, seeing, and speech, we actually have what is sufficient for us to make the claim that God can, that it's possible for him to create a human being and grant them special knowledge and a special proof to oblige people to obey him. And then based on that, we would be able to conclude that this prophet, if he is a prophet, would also have to have necessary attributes. For example, he would have to speak truth. He couldn't say anything that is false. If he speaks falsehood, he can't be a prophet. So we could conclude that anything that the prophet speaks is true. And since what he's saying is true, it means that when we're told that God necessarily has the attributes of seeing, hearing, and speech, we come to know that it is, in fact, true. So it establishes the basis for our understanding and assenting to this category of doctrines, which are known as the sam'iyat, the doctrinal confessions that Muslims hold. And so this other category is what can be derived without depending on it being substantiated by the indication of miracles. And that would then include hearing, seeing, speech, resurrection, the states of the afterlife, etc., etc., etc. Does that make sense? In other words, those particular doctrines are things that if I said I knew vis-a-vis wahi, they do not somehow form a self-generative claim, because what I was able to provide in terms of my rational judgments vis-a-vis the mind alone, insofar as the existence of God and all of the attributes that we've taken up to this point, would be sufficient to get us to the next stage, which is prophetology, and then hold the necessary attributes that we would need for prophets vis-a-vis the mind alone, which then takes us to the Quran. So when we say hearing, seeing, speech, what we're actually doing is we're saying, look, these are necessary attributes, and they're actually things that we don't come to know vis-a-vis the mind. They are known through wahi, but we present them in this way because, we're teaching the aqidah, we're teaching the creed itself. And so there's already an assumption that there's a type of belief that these individuals have. Like, we're all Muslims here, we all believe in the Quran. We're not actually going through the argument for the argument's sake. Like, if we were actually presenting this argument to maybe someone who wasn't a Muslim, we wouldn't include these until maybe later, which is still sufficient, because in order to get us to the next stage, we had already presented what is needed in order to substantiate the claims that would come from there. Hopefully that makes sense. So he says it's necessary for God to have hearing and seeing. And the hearing and seeing, these attributes actually unveil themselves to everything which is in existence, necessary or contingent. Every existent thing. But unlike created hearing, which connects customarily to like sound waves, or sight to bodies and colors and light waves and whatnot, God's hearing and sight is not like that. And the proof for this is the deficiency in positing its opposite. Like, that actually is the basic argument that was given for hearing and seeing and speaking. That given what we've already concluded vis-a-vis reason about the necessity of a necessary being who does not begin and so on and so forth, who has power and will and knowledge, it would be absurd to assume that that being was somehow deaf and, i.e., couldn't hear, and blind, couldn't see, and couldn't speak, was a mute. Which, like I said before, is an argument that's given. It's not necessarily a proof per se, but an argument that's given that I think holds in that sense. So what is his hearing and sight connected to? As Imam al-Sanūsī says, it's connected to every existent thing, which, unlike the doctrines, are in fact proven rationally. So the will and power, we said, connect to every contingent thing. God's hearing and seeing connects to every existent thing, which means both necessary and contingent being. So it attaches to himself and everything else in existence. And it makes sense that his hearing and seeing don't connect to impossible things, since those things are nothing. And then lastly, he says he must also have necessary speech. Necessary speech is an eternal attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this doesn't mean, as he says, that this is harf and sawt. It's not made of created letters and sounds and like vibrating through airwaves. It's the eternal speech of God that manifests the knowledge of the necessary being. So the speech manifests or indicates or expresses his knowledge. So that means that it has to connect to that which the knowledge connects to. In other words, God's speech describes the necessary, possible, and impossible. And the Quran actually shows this. He expresses that he has knowledge of Allat and Uzza, etc. And these are supposed to be gods, like gods besides him. And we know that that's impossible. All they are merely names, like they're not real. And he actually mentions this. إِنْ هِيَ إِلَّا أَسْمَاءٌ سَمَّيْتُمُوهَا أَنْتُمْ وَآبَاؤُكُمْ. Like these are just names that you've given to things. They're not real. They don't indicate anything that is actual or real. But he mentions them, which means that he has knowledge of impossible things, and that knowledge can actually manifest vis-a-vis his eternal speech, i.e. that he's indicating and manifesting that he knows these impossible things. So that's speech. Now, one important takeaway from this is that it's impossible for God's speech to be false. Like, the speech can never be false. For example, it would be impossible that God says something and that turns up to be kadhib. And this is very important because this point has come up, and because people didn't really properly translate it or interpret it, it caused a whole number of other issues. When we say that something is kadhib, the term itself, and what we mean by kadhib, as it was used by the Arab in the early period, it doesn't mean lying per se. Like today we say that in colloquial Arabic, like huwa kadhib, or kadhab, meaning that this person lied or he's a liar. But kadhib in its original sense actually just means something that is not true. It's the opposite of sidq, or truthfulness. And the opposite of truthfulness doesn't merely mean one who intentionally speaks false, which is what we mean when we say somebody lied, that you intentionally spoke false. But rather, it's intentional falsities or unintentional falsities. In other words, even if you didn't mean to say something, like you thought that it was true, but it ended up being false, okay, that would also be kadhib, something that is not true, something that does not correspond to reality. So some people misunderstood this. Like, for example, when it was said by one companion that another companion, kadhib, it didn't mean that he thought he was lying. What they meant by this is that he reported something that is not true. Intentional or unintentional false speech. And this is actually a real issue because this improper, false, wrong understanding has led to countless other misunderstandings on top of this in regards to the Prophet's isma, in the Prophet's infallibility, and what that actually connotes, and takdhib al-nabi, etc. And we'll get to that later. But it's important to note that the speech of God expresses His knowledge, and since His knowledge is absolutely true, His speech is likewise absolutely true. Like, I couldn't say that I know that, your name is, Tom, because your name is not Tom. So I can't, So knowledge is absolutely true, and since the speech connects to everything that the knowledge connects to, it is therefore also absolutely true. Done. Does that make sense? Okay, now really quickly, and then we'll end, inshallah. The last attribute that he goes to of the positive attributes, he says, وَيَجْبُ لَهُ تَعَالَى الْحَيَاةُ لِإِسْتِحَالَةِ وُجُودِ الصِّفَاتِ السَّابِقَةِ بِدُونِهَا. And it's necessary for God to have life on the basis that it would be impossible to establish the preceding positive attributes without it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran says, Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayy al-qayyum. Allah, there's no God except Him, the living, i.e., the one who has life. So life, this attribute means that the necessary being is alive. In what way? We don't know. And this is, there's a kind of self-evident understanding to things which are alive, and we understand that in contrast to something which is just merely existent. And this is what is trying to be said, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has life. And, the debate about what life is actually ongoing in philosophy. And like I said, there's a sort of self-intuitive or self-evident understanding to something that is alive versus something that is not alive. But we don't really know beyond that. And the ta'alluq, or the attachment that this attribute has to the various modalities, is nothing. So his life does not connect to anything, necessary, possible, or impossible. And perhaps you can come into an understanding of it through other disciplines of the Islamic intellectual tradition. So we'll end on this. Those are the 7 attributes of meaning, or the 7 positive attributes. So just to recap real quick, he has power, and that power ultimately brings into existence and takes out of existence. He has will, and will is that selective principle that determines for a thing to be one way over a number of other ways. That he has knowledge, and that knowledge is ultimately something that extends by our knowing that he determined for something to be a particular way over a number of other ways, and that is evident given our observation and examination of the world and its beauty and its precision and its kind of perfectly harmonious and fitting together of things that we see, given the anthropic principles that we talked about. And as we said before, the power and the will connect to everything that is contingent. They do not connect to necessary things or impossible things. And his knowledge connects to necessary, possible, and impossible things. And hearing, seeing, speech that we come to know through wahi, his hearing and seeing are connected to every existent thing, i.e. necessary and contingent things. And his speech is connected to everything that his knowledge is connected to, i.e. necessary, possible, and impossible things. And lastly, life. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is alive, and this attribute is not attached to any of the modalities. We'll end on that. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us knowledge of Him and allow us to come close to Him through this knowledge, to allow this knowledge to animate how we live our lives and how we treat people. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us people of kindness, people of mercy, people of rahmah, people who serve humanity and who love humanity and are constantly expanded in their love for humanity. Ya Rabb al-Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Are there any questions, comments, concerns?